1 Table of Contents Chapter 1 Catastrophism History 2 1.1 Recurring Disaster 1.2 Foundations 1.3 Imminent Concern 1.4 Account of Disaster in Myth and Religion Chapter 2 The CIA Hat Trick How 3 Moves Crushed Catastrophism 12 2.1 What They Discovered in the 1940s 2.2 Hapgood's Parade How the CIA Twisted the Story 2.3 Chan Thomas Truth Falls in the Forest 2.4 The National Science Foundation holds the Shield Chapter 3 The Rebirth of Catastrophism 24 3.1 The Adam and Eve Story 3.2 A Hydra of Science develops Chapter 4 Magnetic Excursions 34.1 The Worst Events and the Good News 4.2 Strange Evidence Chapter 5 Solar Micronova 41 5.1 What is the solar micronova? 5.2 What stars do 5.3 Unlocking the crust at the low velocity zone 5.4 Physical and mythological clues on Earth 5.5 Clues from the moon missions 5.62 Reasons a micronova brings an ice age 5.7 Galactic current sheet Triggering solar system shifts Chapter 6 The next cycle 76 6.1 Earth's magnetic field motion weakening 6.2 Changing planets and the fall of Pluto 6.3 Ominous signs Nearby stars 6.4 What is the best way to judge the current timeline? 6. 5 Planning a collection of advice and ideas diagrams and extra material 101 2.1 Catastrophism History Catastrophism was nearly dead. The fire was nearly out. Over the last few decades, the few researchers who kept a dimming ember from extinguishing have watched one of the most discussed scientific topics in the world become nearly taboo in academic literature, and the coverage of the topic marred by fanatical claims and characters. Catastrophism is the study of horrendous events that punctuate the normally calm and benign Earth we have known all our lives. The field has endured an incredible resurgence since 2018, with new revelations about past events, new scientific discoveries, and the long-needed coalescence of many scientific fields required to understand Earth's catastrophe cycle. The work of modern catastrophists, stoking those dying embers, deserves to be collected and honored as well. Today, we can finally answer a challenge levied over 100 years ago to explain all the evidence associated with these catastrophes. The technology needed to track the next one is here now, and it is telling a terrifying story of the near-term future. 3.1 One recurring disaster Earth enjoys long periods of time molded by the slow crawl of wind, water, and known geologic processes. These eras are punctuated by a cyclical catastrophe. There are 3 critical aspects to the field of catastrophism: analyzing the evidence of the past events, trying to explain their mechanism of operation, and trying to predict the next one. The evidence of cyclical disasters comes in many forms: myth, sediment, fossils, ice cores, and more. Most religions and many ancient cultures describe catastrophe in the past, the future, or both. In Peru, there is a story of the sun standing still in the sky, and in southern South America we find myths of the sun setting in the wrong place. On the other side of the world, Malaysian and Sumatran stories describe a long night they feared would never end. The Bible, Egyptian legends, and other stories from antiquity describe a solar event, often involving a black sun. Furthermore, while numerous geological features are clearly the result of slow wearing and tectonic motion, there are surge deposits filled with the bones of thousands of animals, suggesting that for some areas there is an instant devastation. Amidst sloth-like accumulation of sediment over eons, we find rapid deposits and incredible morphological changes in those layers. Mammoths were found frozen so quickly that the food in their mouths and stomachs had not decayed. What happens to cause these disasters? Cyclical deluges are repeatedly suggested by the evidence, an invasion of the land by the oceans, inspiring questions of Earth tilting on its axis, and other seemingly impossible geological phenomena. Is it a coincidence that the younger Dryas plummet into a deep ice age occurred around the same time as the Gothenburg magnetic excursion? Why are there impactor microtectites from that period and surge deposits in the Americas? What caused the worst period in the late Quaternary megafaunal extinctions across the globe? Why would thriving civilizations in Bolivia suddenly halt work on massive construction projects around 11,000 to 12,000 years ago? What happened to cause evidence of rapid death and bones, and muck to be piled within a mountain in the Pejark Marsh in Australia? How else but via great waves would amazing amounts of shells and boulders reach such great elevations on upslopes from Wales to the Jura Mountains? How did granite blocks come to be on top of the mountains there, and near Death Valley? The Pampean mud deposit could only have been caused by a terrible wave. Such great waves would also deposit dozens of feet of sediment and sand across large areas, likely covering up more evidence than is accessible to scientists today. Other areas would be scoured clean. The deep-sea canyons running down from continental shelves present even further evidence of oceanic washover. Mainstream science tells us these as caused by turbidity currents, and this is truly only a satisfactory explanation for small coastal formations. The only existing videos of in situ turbidity currents, there aren't many, show a slow churning that deposits as much as it carves, and only in sand and softer material, not through rock. There is no model, theory, or existing claim that the turbidity currents could produce the vast formations running off the east coast of South America, or into the northeast Indian Ocean. Scientists largely ignore the features. These canyons are likely runoff features from the last time the oceans were torn from their beds and then drained back into them. https://www.natgeomaps.com/HM 1980 One World Ocean Floor National Geographic 1981. How do we explain all the evidence? The invasion by the ocean, the instant freezing, the stories of strange celestial events during cataclysms, and even the evidence of impactors, geomagnetic changes and strange isotopes found in the cataclysm deposits, all must be explained. That is the challenge, to explain all the evidence. 5.1. Two foundations. When W.B. Walker wrote Cyclical Deluges in 1871, the field was established with well-known characters. Georges Cuvier, the man responsible for comparative anatomy and the recognition of extinctions as a real natural phenomenon, built on the works of Dolomieu and Deluc in the 1700s and early 1800s, bringing the field of catastrophism from infancy to major recognition. By the mid-1800s, the evidence was beginning to clearly show that a recurring deluge was responsible for a considerable portion of stratigraphic and fossilized evidence discovered around the world. Upon meeting with opposition from Western geologists, Cuvier found assistance in the work of Walker, in the process of laying out the evidence of disaster and the causal hypothesis for it. Catastrophism, as we know it, was born. It was in fact just another rebirth of a millenniums-old practice of describing the beginning and ending of worlds. Cyclical deluges can be read for free at https://archive.org/details/cyclicaldeluges/mode/2up. While both Cuvier and Walker made errors in those hypotheses, they were playing a rigged game, without all the pieces to the puzzle, and without all the tools in their tool belt. Walker's version, upon modern review, is at times horrendously racist and difficult to get through for that reason. Everything from the 1700s and 1800s has enough errors based on modern knowledge to easily allow a skeptic to put the works down and try to gain nothing further from them. Nevertheless, they have merit, and they managed to lay the foundation for Emanuel Velikovsky, pictured, and his version of the disaster story in the 1900s. His story is an unlikely theory, but one with many gems in the roughs, and which remains alive today on the periphery of the fire, thanks to David Talbot and members of the Thunderbolts Project. Walker and Cuvier also laid the foundation for Frank Hibben, who used modern evidence inside their catastrophism models, and who repeatedly made the challenge in his works to explain all the evidence. They laid the foundation for Maynard White and Chan Thomas, who would discover so much in the middle of the century that the entire field was intentionally sabotaged. But we'll read more about them in the next chapter. Too often, the mainstream geologists have been overpowering, with their massive amounts of funding, their support from major institutions, and in some cases, as happened to Hibben, his work supporting the science of these disasters was attacked with relatively baseless accusations of academic fraud, despite their abject failures. Without these characters, there would be no catastrophism today. While none of them have answered the call to explain all the evidence and the dark history and future of Earth, it is by following in their footsteps that we see the larger picture. 7.1. 3 imminent concern Earth has magnetic reversals and magnetic excursions. Reversals include a flip of Earth's magnetic field after long, 100,000s of years, epochs, while excursions are rapid flips and flips back of the magnetic pole. Both events include an intensity minimum during the flip that allows space energy to penetrate into the Earth system. Excursions occur much more frequently than full reversals, somewhere around 10,000–15,000 years apart on average. While some researchers believe the cycle to be relatively exact, everything from tilde 11, 500 years Walker, to exactly 12,068 years, Douglas Vogt, to 21,000–26,000 years, axial apsidal precession catastrophism theory. The geologic evidence available today tells a slightly more complex story of the processes involved. In modern science, there are some recognized events that paint a scary picture of the near-term future. Excursions have taken place. 13,000 years ago, Gothenburg, tilde 24,000, 28,000 years ago, Lake Mungo, tilde 33,000, 37,000 years ago, Mono Lake, 46,000 years ago, Lasham, years ago, Greenland Vostok, and years ago, Toba. A rapid look at the most recent events shows to 13,000 years between them, meaning that the cycle is approximately due to reset now. While the exact dating of these events has endured considerable disagreement, as evidenced by the uncertainty of time in which they are supposed to have occurred, they tell a story of a recurring magnetic change on our planet, one that matches other cycle timelines and the evidence of disaster. The forecast that another event is due soon is based on the historical events, but it is also complemented by what we actually see today. The exact changes in Earth's magnetic field we would expect at the beginning of the next magnetic excursion. The magnetic field strength is weakening, and the magnetic poles are shifting. This ongoing shift has been observed and reported by NASA, the European Space Agency, ESA, the USGS, and others, and yet its significance has been downplayed in popular science media and the most important journals, even while world magnetic models require unplanned updates, article pictured, as the shift accelerates. 8 these unplanned updates were the first ever, and were required due to unforeseen motion of the North Magnetic Pole. Specifics on the severity of the disasters and the ongoing magnetic shift will be important topics later in this book. For now, the unwillingness of public science to take the ongoing shift seriously is the impetus to try to understand these events for yourself, including their connection to the cyclical deluges and Earth's catastrophe cycle. Key points. 1. There is evidence of a cyclical disaster of tremendous proportions that punctuations long epochs of geophysical calm. 2. We are due for another disaster event based on the past cycle length. And 3. The magnetic changes we would expect to see are already taking place and accelerating. 9.1. For account of disaster in myth and religion, much of catastrophism relies on hard geological evidence. As we recover more of this evidence, we can better understand the other forms of evidence. The legends, myths, accounts, and prophecies of our ancestors, seeming to match that physical evidence. The ancient stories combining disaster with the oceans and/or the sun are further believable with a new perspective of catastrophe. I can see how Dr. August Dunning, pictured, looks at ancient stories across the world and has agreed that they are discussing the same terrible global disaster. Dr. Dunning is a good friend and one of the most valuable pieces of the field today. He worked for NASA JPL and Caltech and has offered assistance and new ideas in numerous aspects of the catastrophe cycle. He expands on Sumerian tales of the Great Flood and the vast amounts of catastrophism stories provided in Hindu texts by identifying similar ancient corroborating stories from the Book of Joshua, the Scroll of the Upright One, ancient Peruvian and Incan myths, and Native American and Chinese myths. He sees ample evidence to suggest that a series of massive waves overcome the continents, and he also believes that the sun must be involved. the many religions and dead cultures proclaiming to witness or prophesize the stars being hurled from the sky would never mistake asteroids for stars. They may have had a first-grade education, but they knew the heavens very well. The stars being flung from their places is literal. It is a reference to the world turning over, swaying like a drunkard, tilting and twisting, sending the celestial actors diving wayward in the sky from our ancestors' perspective, and adopting new paths across the top of the world. In the practice of Buddhism, there are two main pathways of teaching the end of times. One speaks of the next end of the world and rebirth, coming with the return of Buddha, where the oceans will become lower and the returning Buddha's rays will change people. The lowered oceans result from the water stuck on land after the Great Wave and other aspects of the disaster. 10. The other pathway of Buddha's teaching claims there will be 7 stages of the sun's transformation, including several stages of burning. It is called the Sermon of the Seven Suns and seems to describe a solar flash and eruption. The image here is a symbolic idol piece of this sect. Additionally, Islamic Muslim teachings plainly state that the sun will rise in the wrong place on the Day of Judgment, implying the crust tilts or Earth's rotation endures a grand change. This matches stories from South America. Sunnis believe a black cloud will cover the Earth from seeing the sun. Parts of Earth will sink into the sea like Atlantis, and trumpets will sound, as in the Christian faith. These trumpet sounds are likely the resonance of Earth from the magnitude of the event, which we will describe later. In the Norse myths of Ragnarok, the world is plunged into darkness and cold. The Earth sinks into the roaring ocean as steam rises and the sun blackens. While the Norse mythologies come from Caucasian peoples, they share the same rebirth aspect, cyclical eras of Earth, that are common in Eastern and South American stories, rather than the end of all things paradigm of most Christian apocalypse beliefs. Zoroastrianism, one of the oldest beliefs in existence, teaches that the sun will be more unseen and spotted. They say the days and year will shorten, and men will become vile and divided against each other and against morality and righteousness. This sentiment, a change in humans, is shared among most serious belief systems regarding the end times, including Christianity. The dark sun and the red moon of Christian stories are shared across numerous ancient cultures and legends, seeming to corroborate their merit. The earth sways like a drunkard in many versions as well. In ancient Manichaeism, an early messianic faith whose two symbols are the cross and the sun, they claimed that the light of the sun and moon and stars was recovered out of the world-ending previous darkness, and that this current era will end in darkness with demons flung across the heavens. We will see what these demons actually are in chapters 5 and 6. Interestingly, this 3rd century religion predicted the coming of a prophet of Christ on the other side of 11. The world, to come around the time Joseph Smith was making his unheard of and shocking claims of prophecy in the United States. Speaking of Mormons, while in Salt Lake City in 2020, another researcher named Britton Beckham showed me enough quotes from the Mormon Doctrines and Covenants to convince me that this group had as much of the story of the end as any other religion. The sun, the turning over of the earth, the changes in people all there. By the way, they believe they are commanded to keep a store of preparatory food and survival items, preferably 1 year or more. This is excellent advice. 12.2. The CIA hat trick, how 3 moves crushed catastrophism. 13.2. What they discovered in the 1940s under the threat of Soviet attack over the North Pole. Major Maynard E. White, pictured. Lead the first expedition to map the Arctic. Learn about flight and navigation over the frigid polar regions. Find the magnetic pole position. And generally begin to occupy the front lines of the would-be war of the Arctic. That war never materialized. And instead Major White's team discovered the core evidence used by the U.S. government to begin to understand the disaster cycle. In the late 1940s, his team discovered the magnetic North Pole, evidence of its instability, and evidence of catastrophe after catastrophe, seeming to put the polar region in a hot tropical climate, then frigid polar position in alternating periods. Major White saved records from both the expedition and the meetings at the Pentagon, where the matter would quickly be classified, and he gave those documents to his son, Ken White, to publish after his passing. In 1994, Ken published World in Peril, including all the evidence his father had given him and a considerable amount of his own research. 14. The work described several interesting points about the evidence discovered, specifically the layers of tropical and polar sedimentary evidence found near the Arctic shelves. The layers appear to be separated by 12,000 years. The layers, 5 discovered, each include a magnetic field excursion. The Earth's crust shifts back and forth, putting the current polar regions in the tropics, and then back to the poles. The major magnetic shift takes place rapidly, tilde one day, driving the cyclical deluge and ice age. The scientists initially thought they had found 9 layers, but further study revealed one event was so bad it actually thrust an entire slab over top another to make it appear that the layers had doubled. World in Peril can be read for free at https://archive.org/details/worldinperiltheorigin/mode/2up while White's book was not released until 1994. The evidence suggests that this has been the classified understanding of the U.S. government since at least the late 1940s. While this version does not claim to know the mechanism causing the magnetic shift, just that they happen, there is evidence that these works are what inspired Einstein, in his final years while working with Charles Hapgood, to stop asking if the crust tilted and began to ask how it happened. Einstein died without finding his answer. Part of Einstein's published foreword to Hapgood's first book on catastrophism is reproduced here. A great many empirical data indicate that at each point on the Earth's surface that has been carefully studied, many climatic changes have taken place, apparently quite suddenly. Crustal displacements may take place as the consequence of comparatively slight forces exerted on the crust, derived from the Earth's momentum of rotation, which in turn will tend to alter the axis of rotation of the Earth's crust. Albert Einstein. 15. Einstein's research cohort, Charles Hapgood, is actually the key player in the second act of the Major White story. At the time, there was no CIA, but its predecessor organization, the Office of Strategic Services, OSS, was key at the Pentagon meetings, and Charles Hapgood was on the roster. Hapgood's government life and his public life would eventually overlap due to his involvement in these discoveries, which is where he began to work with Einstein. Interestingly, while they worked together for a number of years, Einstein died 3 years prior to Hapgood's first book release. The disaster information was classified shortly after White's expedition, and they began phase 2 of the cover-up, the Hapgood phase. From Ken White's World in Peril. 16.2. To Hapgood's Parade. How the CIA twisted the story. Most people who have heard of Charles Hapgood heard that he was a professor at some university in the eastern United States. He was at a number of them. And they were hearing this because of his widely publicized Earth crust displacement theory. This was the work that included the foreword by Einstein, which allowed it to carry the respect and weight of the field, cast a shadow over it, contain it within its umbrella, and eventually cause its downfall. At this time, the world was still feeling Einstein's death, let alone the science world, and much of the latter knew he had been obsessed with disaster near the end of his life. It is not an understatement to say that anything with his name was going to overtake any other news in the field, perhaps in science altogether. As we've mentioned, Charles Hapgood was a key figure in the OSS when it morphed into the CIA. He was indeed part of the creation of the organization. He was privy to all of the information from Major White's team and the Pentagon meetings, and he may have even been there, spoken with White, and taken part in the conclusion portion and classification of the material. Yet in the years that followed, he spent his time parading around as just a research professor, advocating for a qualitatively similar but quantitatively offensive version of the disaster, one that did not comport at all with the evidence or the original conclusions offered by Maynard and Ken White, or the Pentagon documents scanned in as part of Ken's book. The length of the disaster, the extent of the crustal shift, and the random polar positions made Hapgood's version of crustal displacement easy to debunk. It did not match the timelines or the paleomagnetic evidence of the pole position stability over time. The evidence from White tells a story of a recurring polar position, offering an easy explanation for evidence of the magnetic poles being in those locations over eons. The timeline deduced by Pentagon scientists matches a good deal of geologic evidence, but Hapgood did not. Is this what Einstein supported during his life? Would he have supported Hapgood's version? Indeed, what happened here? Hapgood had the real facts, so why did we get a scientifically indefensible story? If the subject was classified by his own organization, why was he discussing it at all? The answer is that it was by the CIA's design. It is not unreasonable to suspect that there was concern over the information, getting out, and causing panic, and that they wanted to get ahead of it and squash it, which 17 they did, since Hapgood's version carried the weight of Einstein, as though he had written more than the foreword. When it tanked, it also sunk the entire field of catastrophism, and the concept that the crust can shift. Carl Sagan soon after dispatched Velikovsky's ingenious, but ultimately flawed ideas. Einstein was no longer around to validate that the version given by Hapgood was what he supported. Everyone else was forgotten, and catastrophism began to die. Whether the CIA judged the information to be too easily discoverable, or they had specific knowledge of other researchers hot on its trail, or they just wanted to classify it for other reasons, they perfectly executed the derailment of the entire field of catastrophism, to the point where it is not at all academically acceptable to discuss these topics in mainstream journals anymore. Whatever their reasons for classification, there was in fact someone hot on the trail, someone who had access and clearance, and even managed to get on TV a number of times trying, fruitlessly, to discuss the subject Chan Thomas. 18.2. 3 Chan Thomas truth falls in the forest as a result of a Freedom of Information Act request in 2013. A file was declassified that included selections from the first edition of Chan Thomas' book, The Adam and Eve Story, written in the 1960s. It's not easy to find someone who remembers his poorly selling book, or his TV appearances, and even as it appears that Thomas had working involvement with the CIA, his work on a classified subject was allowed to be done. It was allowed to quietly fizzle, and it received utterly zero support. From CIA Gov. https://www.cia.gov/library/readingroom/document/CIARDP 79B00752A00030070001-8. Interestingly, the original classification code, K, indicates unknown origin of classification. Items usually have T for top secret, C for confidential, or R for restricted. This was something else. Virtually nobody knew about Thomas' book, or his second or third editions in the 1970s and 1990s, and his inclusion of religious and often unnecessary expounding on simple points have offered relief for anyone looking for any reason to put down his work. It also got him lumped in with the many fanatical discussions of the end of the world. Alas, it tells virtually the same story as Major White and the Pentagon. Somehow, while Hapgood and Velikovsky got the spotlight, the most important catastrophist in the 1900s went overlooked. It took until 2018 for Chan Thomas to rightfully gain his place in the world of catastrophism. It can reasonably be estimated that 50,000 people read his books during his lifetime. Now there are millions who know his name. 19 In autumn of 2018, someone sent me an online copy of that declassified file with the Adam and Eve story right from the CIA website. I remember the next many days very well. There was nothing online about Chan Thomas, his book, anything. I tried Google, Yahoo, Bing, DuckDuckGo, everything. This man, whose Catastrophism book appeared in a declassified CIA file, was seemingly a ghost forgotten by the internet. I suggest you search for Chan Thomas on the internet now and see the millions upon millions of search results. The people have power. His photo, full bio, list of other unrelated works, and full copies of all 3 versions of the Adam and Eve story were discovered and put online within just a few days of what has unquestionably marked the rebirth of interest in catastrophism, a video we released in December 2018 called The Next End of the World CIA Classified, Pictured. That video has reached millions of people, and since its release, and the release of 40+ follow-up videos and a full film documentary, a number of modern researchers have witnessed their works collide. The evidence across various fields that quietly and unconnectedly developed over the last few decades has now been compiled here, and we can now finally answer Hibbins' challenge in this book. We will answer all of the evidence, and this penultimate episode in the story of Catastrophism, with the finale being the event itself, all started with the discovery of Thomas' book in a declassified CIA file. It is a shame that his work was rediscovered only after his passing, but we can now honestly credit Chan Thomas with triggering the rebirth of Catastrophism in the new millennium, with his focus on the crust-mantle boundary, like Hapgood, and on the galactic magnetic fields, both of which remain foundational pieces of the next/newest generation of disaster theories in the new millennium. It is inconceivable that this man's work was ignored, and the fact that it appeared in newly declassified CIA files is our only source of speculation as to why it was not more popular in the past. The Adam and Eve story can be read for free at https://archive.org/details/the Adam and Eve story 201,904/page/n2/mode/2up. 20 Thomas' work is a lot like this one. It compiled a lot of the evidence of past disasters, the works of previous catastrophists, and added the latest science. What is most impressive is that he does not mention Major White or the Pentagon files. He must have come to the same crustal shift conclusion by other means. Unlike Hapgood, Einstein, White, and the rest, Thomas had definitively settled on the trigger for his hypothesis. Thomas suggests that the work of Hans Ulf Venn demonstrated how external magnetic fields could overcome the seemingly powerful inertial motion of a spinning magnetized conductive material. Using this concept, and what was known at the time about galactic astrophysics, Thomas skipped over the sun, the focus of the new millennium hypothesis, and suggested the galactic equator was a magnetic null point where the Earth's polarity reversed as our solar system crossed the boundary. More on this theory in Chapter 3. Apart from leaving out the sun for all but the briefest of mentions, Thomas' slight misunderstanding of galactic magnetism belies how close he actually was to the real genesis of the cycle itself. His focus on galactic magnetism offered enough clues to point a modern researcher in the right direction, and those clues waited for decades to be rediscovered through modern science and technology. At very least, the CIA did nothing to support Thomas' work, instead allowing the Einstein flag-waving Professor Hapgood to wash over the entire field like the great waves of the disaster cycle. From Major White to Chan Thomas, the U.S. government has not been transparent with the facts and the publicity of the topic of catastrophism. 21-2. For the National Science Foundation, NSF, holds the shield if there was a fourth element to the CIA cover-up of real catastrophism science. It is the defense of the non-catastrophic public mainstream paradigm that has prevailed since they successfully collapsed the scarier version of the field. Over the years, the most important aspect of this defense has been the mainstream geological science continuing to trounce Hapgood's theory. This is what has kept the scientific community from heading down the path of catastrophism. Scientists have continued to show that the magnetic poles gave evidence of being in their places for millions of years, and have managed to muddy the waters that would otherwise clearly connect the catastrophes. By tracing the funneling of money through National Science Foundation, NSF, grants, which was a leviathan of a forensic accounting effort entirely advanced by Douglas Vogt, the CIA was able to control a large fraction of the relevant scientific publishing. At one point, their involvement in Ivy League science departments became so prolific that Harvard did an expose on their shadowy involvement in the nation's top universities. Pictured. 22. The precedent citation paradigm of academia took it from there. The most cited work debunking Hapgood's version has over 500 citations. Pictured. But has a correction to the article orange type that puts some past polar positions on opposite sides of the globe than was originally reported. When it comes to polar position, the original was as wrong as possible maximum possible wrongness, if I may. The corrections have been cited only a few times. The researchers who published the earliest debunking of Hapgood's version can easily be traced into gatekeeper positions at key journals, and were able to restrict the published science and command the compliance of the field. There is no telling where interference stopped and precedent science took over. It is critical to remember that the evidence supported by the NSF-CIA does nothing against the presumed real facts delivered by Maynard/Ken White and Chan Thomas. They only go against Hapgood's version. A cyclical crustal shift with recurring polar positions throughout geologic time has never been debunked. The immensely flawed practice of carbon dating and other isotope methods was used to further disrupt and confuse the facts tying together many of the events required for the full picture of Earth's catastrophe cycle. To exemplify the absurdity of modern arguments against cyclical catastrophe based on these isotope dates, consider the Australian crater that recently was adjusted from over 300k years old to under 200k, or the Tibetan ice caps adjusted from over 500k years old to potentially being a formation of the Younger Dryas, less than 20k years ago. Picture 23. The pathway that geology has taken has been more convincing to the whole of academia than the words of priests and prophets were to millennia of generations. In truth, the classical stratigraphy and comparative anatomy used by Cuvier was never flawed. We will learn about the result of failures in isotope dating in chapters 5 and 6. Professors have lost grants, positions, and respect over this subject. Programs have been shut down. Researchers have been harassed and worse. This has happened because they tried to take the path of catastrophism. The attacks were coordinated, efficient, and well supported. The use of past tense, were, in the last sentence is because something has changed now. The information on Earth's changing magnetic field has been coming out for years. The recognition of the cycle of Earth is easy to see in the data, and the researchers publishing proof of various aspects of the story are almost uncountable. Nobody is stopping them now. The beast has been let back out of the cage, and it is unclear why. The CIA has done virtually nothing to stop the wildfire of catastrophism from burning this drought-stricken field of science into a raging phoenix. In fact, they seem to be helping it rediscover the ocean's attack. 24. Bhagavata Purana, showing Vishnu rescuing Earth from the demons that captured the world into the sea. 3. The rebirth of catastrophism. 25.3. 1. The Adam and Eve story. The rebirth of catastrophism. There were still those who were well aware of catastrophism in the early parts of the 2000s, including those who had learned about accounts from across the world that matched the stories from the Bible that are told today. The similarities between stories far outweigh the slight changes in time, names, etc. Interestingly, the connection between catastrophism, religion, and modern scientific observations of Earth changes was not at all immediately evident, especially for those with a cognitive dissonance against the concept, or such normalcy bias that these concepts are rejected outright. Velikovsky and Hapgood have not had their theories die, but even as the age of information exposed a new generation to their ideas, it is still common to think of their examinations as separate from the ongoing changes on Earth today. The most widely distributed news coverage on the ongoing magnetic changes, from MIT and NOAA-USGS, makes great efforts to quell concern over the event and makes no attempt to connect the larger picture of evidence. However, as interest in the ongoing magnetic changes of Earth builds, more and more see fit to connect it with the events that had been studied by DeLuc, Hapgood, Cuvier, and others. When we included the work by Chan Thomas, everything changed. Hibben's challenge could be answered with the addition of modern science, and we could fill in the missing pieces from Major White and the Pentagon's initial examination. What has followed has been an astounding flood of interest in this topic, specifically the Thomas version of the disaster as modified to include the sun, and the appropriate galactic astrophysics that causes it. There are hundreds of Facebook groups, YouTube channels, blogs, etc., now dedicated to spreading awareness and gathering information on the catastrophe cycle from across the world. The resurgence of the field and the popularity among the people is the result of Thomas' additions to the disaster cycle mechanism, both at Earth and beyond. Hapgood/Einstein and Thomas were the first to mention the unlocking of the crust at the low velocity zone, crust mantle boundary. Undoubtedly, the best explanation for a crustal shift atop a mantle and core that continue their spin. 26, just below our thin crust, is a thermoelectrically maintained plasticity equilibrium that makes the crust and mantle lock together. Instead of acting like floating objects on liquid, they stick and grip. Both temperature and electromagnetic changes can disrupt this equilibrium and unlock the crust. Without this plasticity locking, the crust would knock about on top of the mantle, lose stability, and be subject to shift. The low-velocity zone sits between the lithosphere and mantle, light blue. Chan Thomas was the first to mention galactic magnetism as the cause of unlocking the crust. He suggested that as the solar system goes through the galactic magnetic reversal and null zone, the electromagnetic equilibrium at the low-velocity zone will fail and the crust will shift. This is incredibly close to the ultimate answer we will propose in this work, but it will ultimately fail to explain the evidence of impactors and strange isotopes, which did exist in scientific literature during his life and should have been addressed. If you are familiar with catastrophism theories about crossing the galactic plane, Chan Thomas' version is the same basic idea, but you likely heard his misguided version based on crossing the galactic equator, which is not where the galactic magnetic reversal occurs. More on this triggering mechanism in chapters 5 and 6. The final answer to Hibbins' challenge required taking one Chan Thomas version. 27.2. Douglas Vought's research on the isotopes, myths, extinctions, and climate records. 3. Robert Felix research on magnetic excursions, ice ages, and the disappearances and appearances of species. 4. The evidence supporting theories of rapid glaciation-deglaciation by numerous researchers like Randall Carlson, and then molding them from theory and story into modern scientific observations in the lab, on the Earth, and in space. This is where the most shocking fraction of the evidence is found the same mainstream science journals that dispatched this science in the first place. 2. Douglas Vogt, Diehold Foundation. Com. YouTube, Diehold Foundation. 3. Robert Felix, Ice Age Now. Com. Magnetic Reversals and Evolutionary Leaps. 4. Randall Carlson, Randall Carlson. Com. 28.3. 2. A Hydra of Science develops there isn't a Velikovsky or Chan Thomas of today. Instead, we have seen the historical macro-scale Renaissance mode of thinking, replaced by specialization and subfields over the last few decades. This shift from the balcony to the microscope is the genesis of both the successful deep understanding of complex topics and the source of most scientists' inability to put this grand catastrophism picture together. To get a PhD and be a regularly publishing member of your field, you lack the time and focus to apply to other disciplines. To break ground and make discoveries in a scientific field today, you almost have to operate in a box. What happens if a ship captain intentionally steers off course, but suffers a stroke and incapacitation that night, allowing the first mate to take control of navigation and steering? It won't take long for the ship to regain its course. Catastrophism is navigating the rough road back to mainstream awareness, and it has not been easy. It will not be easy at any point until the universe snitches on itself as this age of Earth comes to an end. Then it will become difficult in other ways. Like a bear snapping salmon out of the air as they jump an elevation change up a stream, we watch the majority of the journal publications flow like an endless river of homogeneous repetition downhill, until suddenly, something worth catching flies up from the current, moving in the opposite direction against the flow. These rare gems are what we have used to recognize that the debunked ideas aren't so debunked. This is where you find the top scientists in the world doing work that verifies the old stories, and this new one. It must be mating season upstream, because the water is jumping and our bellies are full. The connections between the lines of evidence are clear, and only require access to all the pieces of the puzzle to understand them. This is not a job for the scientists grinding out the math and observations on one bit of the puzzle. This is an interdisciplinary job for a Renaissance artist. This is a list of the journals where we have successfully caught salmon to be combined into Renaissance art. Reviews of geophysics, geophysical research letters, nature, science, physical review letters, astronomy and astrophysics, the Astrophysical Journal, monthly notices of the Royal Astronomical Society, Quaternary Science Reviews Journal. 29 of geophysical research, and more. These represent most of the top journals in geophysical and space science. The salmon come in the form of research in the fields of sedimentology, climatology, geomagnetism, paleoclimatology and paleomagnetism, seismology, geodesy, internal, astronomy, heliophysics, plasma physics, and galactic astrophysics, and they help us tell our version of this story. Scientists' understanding of each, and how each relates to Earth's catastrophe cycle, has matured tremendously in the last few decades, even if not often recognized for what it is. You would be amazed how often that happens the scientists, failing to understand the enormity of something they published. It is like a starving gorilla strayed off through a coconut field, and all he sees are brown rocks because he had no idea food could look like that. These scientists seek the truth and dedicate their lives to their work, and they are hopelessly without most of the proper tools to finish the job. The ultimate traceable genesis of the disaster comes from galactic astrophysics, astronomy, and plasma physics. The immediate effect in our stellar neighborhood is a combination of those fields with heliophysics, which affects the magnetism of the Earth, both of which have effects on climate, geodesy, seismology, and sediment. 34. The magnetic excursions. 31.4. One, the worst events and the good news before we discuss the details of the galactic hand and solar sword of the catastrophe cycle. It is necessary to learn more about the Earth. There has been at least some level of biosphere stress with all the recent geomagnetic excursions, but some are definitely worse than others. During some, a tremendous amount of the biosphere disappears. For others, it might be several bad surge deposits with perhaps only 10% to 20% of species, population numbers being lost and few extinctions. One piece of excellent news is that we have not seen two of the terrible ones in a row, and the last one was a terrible one. In the next chart, we find the known geomagnetic excursions dating back to the Blake event, with a biosphere impact score for each. A 1010 would be a complete extermination of life on Earth. 910 is catastrophic extreme, like Toba, when as little as a few dozen reproducing human females survived. For comparison, a major hurricane or earthquake is unlikely to even register a 1 on this chart, and a volcanic eruption that cools the planet 2-3 degrees might be a 1-3. Excursion name estimate time biosphere impact Gothenburg. Years ago 8/10. Severe. Lake Mungo 28,000 years ago 410 Mono. Lake 37,000 years ago 510. Lashemp 46,000 years ago 810. Severe. Vostok, Greenland. Years ago 5/10 Toba. Years ago 9/10 Extreme. Years ago 4/10. Years ago 4/10 Blake 105-115. 000 years ago 810 Severe. With score of 8 or 9, the Gothenburg, Lashemp, Toba, and Blake magnetic excursions stand out above the Lake Mungo, Mono Lake, and Vostok, Greenland events. The further back in time, the less the evidence stands out, such that we actually have no evidence at all of the events between Toba and Blake. We can't even say for sure there were any. If they did occur, they were not as bad as the really bad ones. It is perhaps comforting that we get at least one break cycle between the horrific events, and 32 perhaps we should expect the next one to be a 4 or a 5. What that means for the severity of the disaster, specifically, will come in Chapter 6. Nearly all the megafauna in North America disappeared in the last event, in surge deposits and muck pits, while mammoths were frozen instantly on the other side of the world. The last event seems to have been extremely bad due to the impactors that arrived with it. The Lashemp excursion, 4 cycles ago, was actually the first magnetic excursion to be discovered by scientists. It was a global catastrophe and has been confirmed more than any other event. This event likely caused the downfall of the Neanderthal species. The Toba event, years ago, coincided with tremendously bad volcanic activity, widespread extinctions, and another star trespassing in our solar system. It is worth knowing that when Skal's star, a red binary, possibly with planets, passed through our solar system, years ago it was likely an amazing sight for all pre-humans alive at the time. It also was a terrible event due to the X-rays and cosmic rays from the star system. A binary star system literally passed through the outer reach of ours. The event was so atrocious, and with the red skis from Toba's eruption, the new red star in the sky was never forgotten. It was often blamed for subsequent events that ancient people couldn't otherwise explain. Skal's binary, Nibiru, is now light years away and is not locked into orbit with our sun. Perhaps there was in fact no geomagnetic excursions between Toba and Blake, and the passing of the binary system 72,000 years ago set the current cycle duration in place. We will likely never know the answer to that one. If there was a planetary shake-up during the stellar encounter, it is a match for Velikovsky's version of the disaster. 33. Back to the question at hand. What exactly is happening to cause volcanic, impactor, oceanic, and other evidence of these events during the magnetic excursions? To explain all the evidence, we must first identify the key pieces of evidence to be explained. New equator polar regions in Chan Thomas work. 34.4. Too strange evidence. Earth's catastrophe cycle is full of strange evidence. Explaining it all is the goal. But over time, there has largely been as much new evidence seeking an explanation as there has been resolution of the existing lot. Scientists have long ignored this problem, using flawed isotope dating to separate most of these events and describe a randomly accident-prone planet with no real rhyme or reason to the occurrence of the disasters. Answer Hibben's challenge. Let's go through the evidence that needs to be explained, piece by piece, starting with the primary element of the traceable cycle, the magnetic excursion. The extra space energy during magnetic minimum of the excursion can cause a considerable amount of the evidence we see all by itself. Changes in cosmic rays and UV light exposure during the low point of our field strength, magnetic minimum, can be catastrophic to DNA, cellular processes, ion exchange, and more. Photosynthetic processes and the microfood chain are exceptionally vulnerable to changes in magnetic fields and radiation. These cosmic rays also affect the weather and can cause cooling, although not enough to freeze a mammoth, which would further harm the biosphere. The magnetic change affects migratory species, like birds and whales, and can even affect plant seed integrity and insect behavior. These further disrupt the biosphere. 35. This is where the work of Robert Felix, pictured, is of great importance, as it tracks the disasters and DNA changes resulting in the disappearance and appearance of species. It is very convincing. Evidence also suggests cosmic rays affect the viscosity of silica-rich magma, and therefore causes explosive volcanic eruptions, which can further cool the planet, in addition to their local devastation. Again, not enough cooling to flash freeze a mammoth. We know the magnetic field is already weakening again now, and the magnetic poles are shifting, pictured, with current positions, directions of motion, meeting place and opposite position on Earth, and magnetic anomalies noted. And the cycle is due up again soon. So, with the observations matching the cycle timing, if we presume we are in a magnetic excursion event now, the question then becomes, can a magnetic excursion explain all the evidence? Data from NASA, NOAA, ESA, WDC, the volcanoes, climate change, radiation, and the extinctions are all reasonably connected to the resulting effects of geomagnetic excursions. The harder part comes in. 36. Explaining the eye impactors. Roman 2. Deluge great waves and all the evidence that comes with them. And Roman 3. Certain rare isotopes from the events themselves. The impactor problem is one that presents the greatest initial challenge to answering Hibben's call. Impactors would be meteors or comet fragments that hit the Earth. The recent crater discovered under the Greenland ice, said to potentially be from the period of the last great disaster, is only one piece of evidence. There are craters, microtectites, glass beads, and other evidence of air bursts, impactors exploding in the atmosphere, like Tunguska, that can be associated with a few of the cycles. The coincidence of major impacts or air bursts tied to these magnetic excursions is confounding from a statistical odds perspective. Nothing about a magnetic excursion would cause impactors. Nothing about an impactor would flip Earth's magnetic field. And we know from geologic evidence and modern observation of the ongoing event that it is a decades to centuries long magnetic process, not a smash and flip scenario. Yet both exist together, and we'll have to explain that. Roman 2. The evidence of the deluge or great waves demands an explanation too. We have already examined the role of the crust-mantle boundary, but the question remains, can a magnetic excursion trigger the low-velocity zone to unlock? When we think about what would cause waves to crash over portions of the continents, we don't have many options. A shift of the crust or total planetary tilt angle, a change in Earth's rotation, massive areas of land rising and falling, or a combination. When we remember the stories of the sun setting in the wrong place, standing still in the sky, and the stories of the long night when the sun seemed almost a day late in rising to a then panic-stricken ancient civilization, what else could explain it? The tropical and polar fossil layers discovered by Major White's team, alternating every cycle, speak to a turning over of the Earth, the physics nightmare. The shifting back and forth of the crust helps us answer the mystery of the cause of the great waves, and also the persistence of magnetic pole position in similar places over eons. A reversal in Earth's rotation, Vogg's hypothesis, would leave the geographic poles where they are too, but with little chance for tropical biological deposition since the poles never go to the equator, and the waves would have no north-south component. It would also require the entire Earth to stop and spin the other way. This is a relatively indefensible 37 proposition from a scientific standpoint, and mere crustal shifts and tilts of the planet can produce the great waves and the celestial sights from the ground. The rising and falling land concept is terrific. It can explain the waves, the stories of Atlantis, Mu and others that allegedly sank into the sea, and it may even explain the slosh of tropical muck to the polar regions as it runs off, elevating equatorial regions. While this is a good piece of the puzzle, it cannot be the entire story of the great waves. It doesn't help explain the stories of the sun standing still or rising in the wrong place if the crust, tilt, and rotation do not change. If, however, the rising and falling is caused by something that also causes the crust to shift, perhaps with the shifting plates functioning to trigger the rise and fall of land, then we have a way for the plates to twist and shift at the faults, or for the entire outer shell to be yanked by various forces like ice weight. This was Einstein's favorite idea, but he couldn't figure out how to unlock the crust from the mantle. There simply would never be enough weight in ice to undo the friction at the crust-mantle boundary. The mechanism described by Thomas also occurs at the low-velocity zone, crust-mantle boundary. The axis and spin of the core and mantle do not change. It is at the low-velocity zone plasticity layer, where rock sits on liquid, where an electromagnetic or thermal event, or both, can disrupt the friction holding them together, allowing the crust to shift. Surely the oceans don't just decide to escape the seabeds without a great force or tilt rotation change of the Earth. So let's examine the two different geomagnetic events that are known to affect this crust-mantle boundary. In the next image, we come back to the electromagnetic aspects of the Earth to consider some of the strange evidence in modern times that this planet is not as stable as we think it is. 38 to do so. Let us examine the minor version of crustal shifts that we do see in modern times. Yes, they happen. They are called length of day (LOD) glitches. They are literal glitches in the rotation of the crust atop the mantle. These are merely millisecond glitches, causing no damage or awareness to humans, and quickly recover. These smaller glitches we see in modern times have two known well-correlated phenomena. One is a geomagnetic jerk emanating from Earth's core. These are magnetic glitches near the core, like a small pothole in the street, not going to send the car off the road, that sometimes can cause a similarly tiny glitch in the Earth's rotation. The second cause is strong geomagnetic storm activity triggered by the sun. While scientists argue the mechanism at work, we know that even common solar storms can induce current through the crust and into the mantle, especially at subduction regions. By some yet-discovered mechanism, geomagnetic jerks and strong geomagnetic storms can both touch the low-velocity zone. Think of this crustal unlocking like supervolcanoes, major asteroid impacts, and megaquakes, which are the bigger versions of effusive eruptions, meteor shows, and tectonic grinding. Earth's modern rotation, LOD, glitches tied to geomagnetic jerks and geomagnetic storms are the smaller versions of what happens in the Great Disaster to unlock the entire crust. The question remains, Is the magnetic excursion enough to explain the electromagnetic breakdown at the crust-mantle boundary? Maybe, maybe not. It seems like a total global magnetic shift has a good chance of disrupting the low-velocity zone, but it certainly. 39 doesn't help us explain the impactors. Regardless of the answer, there is another explanation, and it does explain the impactors. It also explains the third strange piece of evidence, Roman 3. Roman 3. Aluminum 26, iron 60, and numerous other elements can be found on Earth that are very difficult to produce. A number of these isotopes, especially some of the transuranic flavors, elements higher in atomic number than uranium, must be produced in nova events. Nova elements are not a surprise here on Earth. We exist among the remnants of previous novae. The solar system formed from one, and they happen regularly over time in the galaxy. The problem is with some of the isotopes found to have half-lives demanding that they not be here right now. Some transuranic elements decay so quickly that there is no way they were here when we formed as a solar system. That's too long ago. And there is no way they could be from some faraway nova, as it would take too long to arrive here. If it was a recent and nearby supernova, it would have likely sterilized the Earth, if not destroyed the entire solar system, and that didn't happen. Explaining these isotopes is a big problem. Some of them are found in the bones of animals in the surge deposits and muck pits from the cyclical disasters, and in the microtectites as well. Now this is a very big problem, and it gets even worse. We learned in 2020 that when magnetic fields are modeled with nova remnants, the dust carrying many of the isotopes stays in the remnant, trapped like dusty magnetic pinballs, pictured, suggesting that the producer of Earth's very recent nova isotopes must be very nearby. 40, it is very nearby. It is the Sun, a long-period recurrent micronova star. The Sun is the answer to Hibben's challenge, at least the bulk of it. What triggers the Sun to act? Section 5.7 cleans up the evidential debris left behind by Thomas and Einstein. The micronova would produce a magnificent geomagnetic storm that could easily induce past the mantle to the core, and even induce a geomagnetic jerk, bringing the two LOD-glitch triggers at the same time. A micronova shell erupting from the Sun has pieces flying off into space, there's your impactors, and obviously produces the nova isotope cosmic rays and dust-trapped particles. In the next 2 chapters, we will learn why the recurrent solar micronova is not just the ultimate answer to unlocking the crust, but also to the rapid freeze of mammoths. It will also finally answer why there is this catastrophe cycle in the first place. 41.5. Solar micronova. 42.5. 1. What is the solar micronova? Disaster, noun. Combination of ill, negative, pejorative, and aster, star. The Sun shines down on the Earth with life-giving light that looks yellow and white as it crosses the sky. But one day that will change. Dust, gas, and plasma will begin to accumulate in the Sun's atmosphere, causing a dimming to a reddish hue. When the Sun darkens almost black from accumulation, the light and solar plasma cannot escape, and the energetic pressure inside the solar atmosphere grows. The pressure eventually overcomes the outer shell, erupting in a micronova. The initial eruption will produce a bright flash of visible UV and X-ray light, which may thermally and energetically destroy parts of the biosphere. This is the burning aspect described by the Buddhist sermon of the 7 suns. This phase will not last for very long, a few minutes at most, or even possibly just a few seconds. For the next 420 hours, until the micronova shockwave arrives at Earth, energetic protons and electrons will be bombarding the upper atmosphere, delivering an incredible excess of electricity. Ambient atmospheric electricity, telluric currents, and atmospheric pressure cells connected to the global electric circuit will all be amplified. When the shockwave arrives, it will be a long impact, hours to days to even weeks. At first, the shockwave will be comprised mostly of plasma, accelerated to high speeds, which 43 would induce electrical disruptions on Earth that would destroy every power grid, create more unstable atmospheric electricity conditions, and could even cause a sun-facing magnetic field collapse, bringing an arc discharge, similar to a magnetar burst from the sky to the ground, pictured. It will also begin to bring the isotopes of the nova. The bombardment will transition from plasma to dust and other molecules as the second component of the wave arrives, which will have the isotopes of heavy elements in the nova attached to the dust, and which will present itself in vastly non-homogeneous ways. If you're facing the sun when the plasma arrives, it may be nighttime when the dust and heavier components hit. The turning of the Earth through the phases of the shockwave impact means that the isotope distribution is different across the globe. This is missed in all dating techniques. At this point, the dust begins to block out the sky, and it lingers in the inner solar system while the larger pieces of the shell arrive the impactors. Silicate material like glass and congealed cooled plasma and dust that have agglomerated in the shell expansion will arrive at the end of the shockwave, and the bombardment here likely plays a key role in how bad of a disaster the Earth actually faces. If larger pieces hit the Earth, it could turn a bad event into a cataclysm. 44. The dust continues to linger in the solar system and at the top of Earth's atmosphere, just as nuclear or volcanic winter might do, and we enter a period of tremendous cooling due to lack of sunlight. The extra water vapor evaporated by the heat and electricity of the micronova thus far will then be frozen and dropped as snow and ice to reflect even more sunlight. This story will continue in Chapter 6, but for now, suffice to say that eventually, the atmospheric freeze-out and lowered evaporation, due to lower temperatures, leaves the atmosphere at a deficit of vapor clouds. And as the dust fades away, the planet quickly warms again, aided by super flare activity, which heats instead of cools, expected to occur in the wake of the micronova magnetic disruption to the sun. In the next section, we will learn where the solar micronova fits into the larger stellar explosion picture. 45.5. To What Stars Do This image is from our Solar Terrestrial Physics textbook, Weatherman's Guide to the Sun, 3rd edition. And it is a great place to begin. The chart is relatively self-explanatory, but some interesting points should be made, including the fact that the sun's micronova is not the smallest kind of nova, and we have indeed seen numerous nova in space that fall short of the energy range we expect to occur when the sun erupts. The Type 1 X-ray bursts from pulsars are indeed more energetic in luminosity, but they have very small explosion shock waves. They would barely reach Mercury if they happened on the sun. True enough, it wouldn't matter because the X-rays would destroy the planets. But the point is that the sun's expected blast is not so small that it is outside the realm of science. For sure, it can't be so big that it would destroy the Earth, because we are still here. There are 3 general categories of nova events: supernovae, classical novae, and rapidly recurrent nova. The recurring novae are the door to this subfield of study, and can span a range from classical nova energy down to dwarf nova and below. Only the supernova results in the destruction of the star, and not all the time, and the other 2 leave behind a star that can have another nova. Many astronomers believe that all classical novae recur, and that the main difference between classical and rapidly recurrent novae is a recurrence scale of thousands to millions of years versus years to decades. We have seen many recurrent novae with cycles in the decades, and one in Andromeda that appears to go off every Earth year. The sun's event would be between the rapidly recurrent novae and the million-year cycle stars, approximately on a 10,000 to 15,000 year cycle. The recurrent nova events are said to be caused by an accretion and accumulation of material in the stellar atmosphere, a metaphorical blocking the pressure vent. Scientists. 46 believe these are white dwarf stars with binaries where the dwarf sucks material off its sister star. After accumulation in the atmosphere begins, the buildup of light and particle and thermal energy in the atmosphere will eventually overcome the shell, and it erupts, leaving the interior behind. Some supernovae, Type 1, are said to occur in this way as well. Except in those events, the stellar pressure cooker overheats to the point where the entire interior explodes. However, this umbrella theory has a major problem when applied to all such events. The Type 1 supernova versions of the accretion mechanism do often have binary remnants identifiable in space observations, but not all. And in fact, there are very few recurrent nova with an observed binary. They are merely presumed to be there. So, do we need a binary? In September 2020, a Type 1 supernova was discovered to have no partner, which blows open the door for the smaller, non-super recurring events to not require one either. 1 week later, they discovered a transient, sporadic accretion recurrent nova that is still on a regular cycle. The door is now wide open. But the science of 2020 wasn't done yet. In a paper titled Simulations of Multiple Nova Eruptions Induced by Wind Accretion in Symbiotic Systems, it was demonstrated that the standard model of these eruptions was too strict, and that the donor star sending material into the other's atmosphere could be of any type. This further indicates that various accretion and accumulation schemes are viable options. In fact, virtually any similar interaction can induce an outburst from a star. In October 2020, Dr. Safyu of the University of Tokyo reported the discovery of a poor little star that wandered into a molecular cloud and exploded. In the next image from Dr. Safyu's paper, we can see the cloud of gas and dust, gray on the left, green-yellow on the right, and the spherical cavity in the middle where the star exploded. This occurred because the star entered the cloud, and the interaction triggered the nova event, likely by accretion. 48 It is almost certain that many binary systems in space perform the recurrent accretion nova action, but it is just as certain that a binary star is not necessarily required. Any threshold-reaching change in space environment could induce the same result. That includes shock waves from other supernovae molecular clouds and the spiral arms of gas and dust density in the galaxy. These are space encounters that our sun almost surely endures. The stellar atmosphere accumulation might also occur from a temporary drop in stellar output energy, a decrease of solar wind output, which causes the accumulation. In section 5.7, we will learn about a feature in our galaxy that we know exists, and which can deliver a 1-2 punch to the sun, providing both a surplus of dust and gas for accretion, and potentially an electromagnetic disruption of the sun's solar wind output. In November 2020, a review of isotope records in tree rings revealed a nova-level spike around 13,000 years ago, Gothenburg, and another strong signature around 23,000 years ago, but with an 8,000-year error range on the latter, which puts it firmly within the Lake Mungo event range. Either there were separate magnetic excursions, impactor event, instant freeze mammoths, and supernova isotope effects occurring only at relatively similar times in history, or there is a cyclical solar micronova. 49.5. 3. Unlocking the crust at the low velocity zone catastrophe. Noun. The Latin catastrophe and Greek catastrophe means an overturning or sudden end. Nearly all scholars choose to ignore the astro in the middle of the word catastrophe. In Latin, astro means horoscope, relating to the heavens, and in Greek, it has the same modern meaning star. We have already described a lot about unlocking the crust. We know that the crust is sitting on liquid rock not far down below. If it were not for a thermoelectric plasticity between the layers, the crust would be free to shift. But how does it get unlocked in the big event? We now return to the length of day glitches, cited as the anomalies in the crustal rotation atop the mantle. We recall that there are two known statistically based correlations: geomagnetic jerks and solar storms. When normal solar activity routinely accesses the crust and mantle, we know that it is already capable of delivering electromagnetic changes to the appropriate layer between the two. As we mentioned in section 4.2, a tremendously powerful solar storm could induce currents all the way to the core mantle boundary and throughout the Earth, which may lead to a geologically unscheduled geomagnetic jerk, while the strongest of solar storms is concurrently affecting the appropriate layer. This makes for the two known statistically correlated rotation glitch phenomena, at the same time, to a potentially extreme level. 50 when you consider the fact that it takes a thermal or electromagnetic modulation of the low velocity zone to unlock the crust from the mantle, the geomagnetic jerk and solar storm effects make sense. When you consider that both can be delivered at the same time with a large enough solar blast, it is a well-fitting puzzle. When the solar micronova is the only way to also explain the isotopes and the impactors, the puzzle is nearing completion. In section 5.7, we will learn why the micronova happens at the crescendo of the galactic magnetic event. As the crust is shifting and lifting and falling and twisting, we also have the potential for tremendous mantle and crustal heaving, which is exactly as terrible as it sounds. Let us take the example of olivine, which is the most abundant molecule in the crust and is also abundant in the upper mantle. Olivine can be capacitized and upon discharge can translocate. Billy Yelverton performed experiments that demonstrate how even a non-kinetic interaction can cause olivine to move around, sometimes to a tremendous extent. He simply supplied electric current to olivine crystals, discharged the current, and watched the crystals fly. In these two images, we see the before and after of Yelverton's olivine discharge experiment. On the left, we see a pile of crystals, and after supplying current with the electrode above, a grounding rod was slowly slid into the center of the pile. The deformation of the pile is due to the prodding of the rod, but the crystals that left the pile did so dramatically, just shooting out. On the next page is a similar before and after. Again, with a slow, gentle prodding of the rod, but with significant translocation of the olivine. 51. These experiments can be watched in real time as part of our video on predicting seismic activity. https://youtube.b/jmsi6vp3qvk. He also performed experiments with water, showing how its translocation follows electric currents, increasingly with salinity. There is estimated to be more water locked in the mantle than in the entire surface oceans. 52. He was even able to get the water to push up against gravity on the rock layers above, as seen in the sequential images that follow. Before current on, water pushes up 25 seconds. It is worth knowing and respecting Yelverton's work in the lab. He has shown a new light on electric geology that had never existed in the history of catastrophism. From a laboratory standpoint, perhaps only Anthony Perret, Los Alamos National Lab Department of Energy, has contributed more to the plasma physics of the catastrophe. Coincidentally, Dr. Perret, who was once in charge of the entire nuclear energy program for the USA, also believes the sun triggers disasters on this planet every 10-15,000 years, and that we are due again soon. Dr. Perret is a good friend of mine and is now retired, living in Los Alamos, NM. Yelverton is also one of my closest friends and currently lives near Albany, Georgia. Beyond the induced current effects on water and olivine, the remainder of the mantle is considerably made up of melted or melting rocks, metals, and crystals, which have electromagnetic reactivity. Likewise, we are left with the bulk product of the upper mantle being subject to tremendous force in such a magnificent electromagnetic event. However, the scariest aspect of mantle heaving would include a breakdown of the internal skeleton of Earth. In the micronova, the internal structure of the planet can be affected in addition to the components of the liquid mantle. 53. What previous catastrophists did not know was how much of an internal structure exists within the planet. Numerous studies have shown that there are massive plumbing branches that extend from the outer core region up through the mantle, even fingering out in thin extensions up through the crust. These have been named large low shear velocity provinces, or LLSVPs. 54. When we consider the real structure of the planet, and the fact that the internal skeleton density is an even more conductive pathway to the core and throughout the internal Earth, one begins to run into the problem of having too many ways to twist the world, instead of asking how such a thing could happen. A popular media scientist with a YouTube channel called Veritasium recently showed how the intermediate axis theorem can make spinning objects subject to flipping over and somehow returning back to their original position after another flip. This is pretty close to what we are looking for with the Earth. However, he highlighted that this does not apply to symmetrical spherical objects, and then incorrectly applied this concept to the Earth, apparently unaware that we are not a symmetrically constructed planet. The ocean beds, equatorial bulge, and internal imbalance of the structure, LLSVPs, makes Earth an asymmetrical body both inside and out. This is yet one more reason to question the immovable orientation of the crust and whole planet. Veritasium got the science correct in terms of the physics of rotating bodies, but he mistakenly believed parts of it did not apply to Earth. 55.5. 4 physical and mythological clues on Earth in 2014-2015. I spent a good deal of time touring the USA and Canada in the Mobile Observatory project. My wife Catherine and I turned a 36 Class A RV into the show on the road, doing talks at schools, sun watching with telescopes, museum events, and more. During 2 separate periods, we had the pleasure of Michael Steinbacher's company, Pictured. He and I explored Oregon and the Arizona-California border regions. The evidence was clear for both mainstream explanations, the slow crawl of geology forced by wind and water, and for rapid cataclysmic events. Both exist amidst one another. My favorite thing about Michael was his open mind. I'm not sure he'd have committed to much more than his name, and 1 + 1 = 2. His modus operandi was option A, B, C, until his imagination could work no more. This is why he was able to spot intense burns in mountaintops and canyon walls, amidst what is legitimately 500 million year water and erosion process formation. There is a valley northwest of Phoenix and Flagstaff where you can see where a past wave crested, deposited material, and washed back. Everywhere we went we saw A, B, C, etc., acting in concert over time and available only as a snapshot to us now. Michael lost his battle with cancer just a few months later. In 2020, my family drove from Denver to Salt Lake City via Interstate 70. The lessons had not waned. I could see the deposits of sediment, where the waves finally crested, and how Vail sitting at 8,000 feet appeared to lack any similar evidence. But just 2,000 feet lower, it was as though only the tops of the mountains were spared, as the water found easier paths through the valleys. Where those crests hit mountains, the road cuts were heavy with black shiny layers of biomass, and numerous old coal mining operations can be seen on the drive. Inches to feet thick of dead compressed biomass is a surge deposit from the great waves, and we see them over and over and over again on top of sediment layers. The slow working of geology was visible too, just not alone. It is worth considering that each great wave would deposit multiple strata, layers, of new sediment, and that some biomass sinks and others float. The new sediment washing in with the wave always forms the frothy leading edge. It's not just water, but trees, dirt, 56 boulders, animals, and sand. After the leading edge sediment, the sunk biomass layer deposits begin to be crushed as coal by another layer of sediment, and then the floating biomass layer, finally followed by one more thin sediment layer that falls from the sky. For areas where the waves hit and strongly wash back, there may be multiple versions of these layers in every great wave event. Things said to be 100s of millions of years old may be from great events merely 100s of thousands of years ago, with layers separated by hours to days, not eons. Yet, each layer comes from a different distance, carrying a unique carbon and isotope signature from the Earth's continued rotation through the changing character of the micronova shell, and it fools the scientists all these millennia later. By the time I got to Utah to see the desert sand formations allegedly 100 million years old, it was obvious that, by itself, the ancient inland sea or lake concept was untenable given the winds endured in some of the Badlands areas. These formations would be eroded by rain, or blown away or covered up by other particles in less than 1 million years. A deposition date of 12,000 years ago, (1). 2% of 1 million is much more realistic, especially when the other side of the valley looks nothing like it, nor does the other side of the range. In fact, numerous parts of the Rockies contain this harsh desert-like edge to the western sides of the mountains, and lush forest with ponderosa pines on the east-facing side. The mountain face scouring is not from sand-laden wind or erosion. It is as though a giant beast tore at the mountains with its claws, but only on one side. It suggests the direction of a past wave scoured one side and deposited sediment on the other. The Chumash Native Americans, whose ancestors inhabited the western USA for millennia, describe this great flood event as one of the core defining moments in their history. You can go look for evidence of washovers, deposits, and more if you can get to untouched land. In many places where there is rock exposed in the desert, you can find the rock art of the ancients and burned scars on the rock to match. Geologists will say the geology came millions of years before the art, but the art makes a different claim. You can still see evidence of both the slow crawl of geology and the terrible punctuations of disaster if you get out and look for it. The microtectite glass beads from these periods are perhaps my favorite pieces of evidence, and they suggest a tremendous event. These glass beads can be made by air-bursting asteroids, volcano eruptions, and also in the micronova event, as silicon and oxygen combine in the electromagnetic bonanza of the shockwave. We have seen high silicon and oxygen content in numerous other novae, and earthly lunar microtectites have been shown to contain some of those isotopes that initially pointed to a solar micronova. 57. The similar isotopes in the bones of the animals in the surge deposits from the last event solidify the nova aspect of the disaster. One cannot first find those isotopes in the glass beads and bones of the animals in Alaskan muck pits from 12,000 years ago, and then think any other star made them. The Earth would be sterilized if it was close, or they wouldn't have arrived, yet if it was far enough away. This evidence was largely put together by Douglas Vogt, who is the first person to suggest a nova event on the Sun was the cause of disaster. The Sun isn't the only sphere to have a major discharge event in the catastrophe. The catastrophists who kept the field alive in the 1990s and 2000s, Talbot and Perret, were primarily interested in the interpretation and analysis of the Great Cosmic Thunderbolt. In Egypt, Dr. Robert Schoch has found more of both myth and physical evidence for this cosmic thunderbolt. The magnetic fields and upper atmospheric electric layers are both compressed and energized when taking impact from solar storms. The images below show a solar shockwave, yellow, before and after compressing the sun-facing fields. Almost every time the sun puts more regular, smaller eruptions our way, there is an easy pathway along the Earth's magnetic fields to the poles or into the magnetotail to be ejected into space. However, in the biggest of compressions, likely from a nova shockwave, the fields would be very compressed and very energized. And if a straight-down discharge is the easiest pathway, it will take it devastatingly. By compressing the magnetic fields, they can arc downward and reconnect at the surface. This would be bad on a normal day, but if it was energized by a micronova shockwave, it would deliver incredible electrical energy directly down from the sky. Many magnetar theories also contain this mechanism, including a potential crack in the surface of the star, pictured. 58, it would take the form of a giant lightning discharge and could carve stone and land. This is where Dr. Schoch comes in. He identifies early Egyptian stories of a great lightning bolt knocking off the back of the Sphinx, and nearby he has also found vitrified rocks, which require either that exact cosmic lightning discharge or a meteor impact. There are no other options for how it was created. There is no crater, and an impactor would have destroyed the entire region, not just knocked off the back of a single monument. Impressively, Dr. Schoch literally found the strike point. Interestingly, the Earth and surrounding space maintain an energetic equilibrium, so if such a bolt comes down, one may very well go up and out somewhere else. Maybe Dr. Schoch found the discharge point. In our plasma laboratory, Billy Yelverton has created numerous alike sedimentary and rock features by electric discharge or sustained current application. Many appear identical to formations you would see on the Earth, the Moon, and Mars. 59 from Billy Yelverton's /Space. Weather News. One feature that Yelverton has been very helpful in understanding is the rare cosmological event, RCE. These features are so named because they don't know else to call them. In the center of a few muscovite mica crystals. In fact, only a few have been found. Microanalysis has revealed a rare and unexplainable event. It is possible that the rarity of fine detail analysis required to spot these features has led to many being overlooked, but still, they are enough for a mystery. Rare cosmological event, RCE. 60. The feature, pictured, looks like a cosmic jet, with a central node and what appear to be blasted out portions of the crystal. The peripheral black marks are the fission tracks of the cosmic ray isotopes we've discussed already. The main jet feature and central dark nodes are similar carve-outs of the crystal, with matter simply missing. Unlike the surrounding fission tracks, however, there is no entry point into the crystal for the RCE. These RCEs initiate wholly within the crystal and implicate a saturation of the crystal in a charged environment, where the energy taken in overcomes the structural integrity. with the energy still being greater outside the crystal, leaving outward pathways unfit for discharge. The discharge occurs within. It does so as a dipolar explosion inside the crystal. This is what they can't explain. They have no tools to describe how these crystals endured such energies. It is almost as though the Earth itself would need to be bathed in such energy, or at least the considerable surrounding region. The name, rare cosmological event, for these Muscovite mica features is actually not far off. The electric field of the micronova is an excellent candidate for the saturation of the crystals and the internal explosion due to overcharging. A rare cosmological event, indeed. Yelverton is also responsible for the entry of a new element into the geologic and sedimentary aspect of the Great Waves. Perhaps the most shocking evidence of the last event is not the mammoths or the surge deposits of bone and muck, it is the Texas rock wall. Photo, Chad Riley. 61 photo, Jock William Doubleday tooled blocks, mortar between them, 70 feet tall and stretching for 20 miles around an enclosed area. There are triangles, right angles, and even the blocks themselves are limestone, the choice block of ancient builders. This wall isn't above ground, it's below it, and extending 70 feet below it. The entire structure was covered up somehow. That is a double entendre, covered up with sediment and covered up in source. Photo source unknown map connecting the findings of the dozens of excavations. There are a few findings that appear to be isolated, marked in the same red color as dots or lines, mostly near the top of this image. The new millennium explanation for the Texas rock wall is that it's not a wall, it's a natural formation. That's right, they want you to believe that those cut blocks, mortar, limestone, geometric shapes, cohesiveness, and size are an accident of nature. 62 evidence do they use to justify this explanation. A few geologists took samples of different pieces of the rock wall, and they determined that all the magnetic fields were oriented the same direction throughout the wall. Even more, they believe that the structure dates to more than 80 million years old. We have already discussed the difficulty of these dating techniques and numerous examples of failure, but the magnetic findings are the more interesting part. The professor said that humans would have randomly cut and laid the blocks, without knowledge or care for their magnetic fields. Therefore, they should be randomly oriented and not coherent. He therefore sees coherent fields as a sign it is natural. Ancient people were known to build monoliths on Earth's magnetic ley lines, and we should not so readily dismiss what ancient eyes could see. More importantly, if that massive wall had been above ground before the last solar micronova, the isotope distribution would be asinine from a dating perspective, and the electric field, induced current, or magnetic fields of the event may have imprinted on the rocks, especially since the induction in such a large coherent structure could cause melting or softening, and vulnerability to magnetic reorientation. The Great Waves could have easily buried the entire structure in sediment. It may also have knocked over some portions of the structure, which is why there are unconnected pieces of the wall identified on the map. To reconcile the isotope dating, magnetic orientation, and the appearance and physical character of the rock wall is impossible. There is no way any rational person could believe this is a natural structure, and if it is 80 million years old, tens of millions of years before the dinosaurs disappeared, we need to have a different discussion. If you are one who believes dinosaurs and man lived together, you can feel free to believe they built the wall to keep out T-Rex, but don't for a moment think this rock and mortar wall is natural. Nature doesn't do geometry at that scale. Something atrocious happened and covered up the city and the wall, likely during the last great Americas-focused micronova shockwave. The last note in this section is important. Let's go back to the RCE in Muscovite mica and recall how it blasted out in a north-south configuration. Now, look again at the mantle structure, but this time with it tilted 90 degrees. 63 during the micronova, I do expect the existing structures to break down as the energy induces to the core. If the core is bathed in energy within the shockwave, and there is not a proper pathway for discharge outward, we could see the same, RCE, like north-south plume out from the core in new internal structures. They would then pull the Earth 90 degrees, sit at the equator, and reset the poles the next cycle. If the new plumes came out perfectly identical and symmetrical around the spin axis, maybe nothing happens. If there is any deviation, they will want to spin at the equator, like Einstein knew weight asymmetries would. This is millions of times the weight of Greenland and Antarctica, and Einstein was only about 50x short. 50x sounds psychotic when thinking about piling ice on top of Greenland, but not so much if core plumes weigh as much as continents. As a matter of interest, the African lobe is taller, less dense and more vulnerably oriented against the mantle motion than the Pacific lobe. The African lobe is more likely to break first. 64.5. 5 clues from the moon missions. Another place that Dr. Dunning and Douglas Vogt have been incredibly helpful is in the identification of potential evidence on the moon. From the myths of the moon turning red or burnt orange as a great solar flash cooks the surface, to the complicated chemistry and grueling search through archived imagery, there is a wealth of evidence of these previous events. Vogt's analysis of the glass discovered during Apollo missions, the tests they performed, the discussions of the astronauts while on the moon, and even the symbolism of organizations involved tell the same story. The importance of the lunar findings explains both why they never went back to the moon and why there has never been much pushback on the conspiracy that they never went. They are happy as long as we don't know the real facts. As a matter of interest, the conspiracies that we did not go to the moon are some of the worst elements harming the credibility of the entire community that seeks alternative explanations for scientific phenomena. When they went to the moon, they did not go directly through the scary part of the Van Allen belts, and they were in the outer ring for a short while. With the level of technological theft at the time, the makeup of the vessel provided to the public may not even fully reflect reality. There are many ways they could shield or direct the energy they encountered. They went to the moon, end of story, but they just might have had a few tricks up their sleeve. 65. The symbolism of the Apollo mission is another matter. Why name the lunar mission Apollo? Apollo had nothing to do with the moon, as he was a solar deity. The overall mission logo, pictured, appears to show the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, with one being the sun itself, more or less in their appropriate colors. The apocalyptic horseman symbolism is 1, white, wearing a crown, 2, red, stealing the civility of the people, 3, black, holding the scales of justice, and 4, pale, and hell follows with him. The changing magnetic field of Earth is going to change how we see light from space. Light is an electromagnetic wave. The filtering of various color spectra is diminished under the ongoing weakening of Earth's field, such that the yellow sun now appears so brightly white at the top of the sky that it has brilliant rays radially shooting out like it is wearing a crown. If the solar output slows down or accumulation builds in the sun's atmosphere, it will turn red, and through fear and panic, the people will lose much of their humanity. When accumulation overcomes the sun and blocks the pressure vent, it will look black, and its equatorial electric field will glow visibly around its equator, appearing like a tipping scale used in antiquity. When the internal solar pressure builds and finally blasts off the 66 accumulated outer shell in the micronova, we will peer through the dust and gas and plasma and once again see that familiar pale yellow hue, but hell follows with it. How can that possibly be a coincidence, on top of what would have to be hundreds of other coincidences listed in this manuscript? If you look online now for this logo, you will find an altered one where all the horses appear yellow. This is not the original, pictured. A quick note on Mars. Mars is much more difficult to analyze. Vogt has identified what he believes to be ancient ships from orbiting satellite imagery, but many have found these examples to be less convincing than his other claims. The rover data is more interesting because it gives a first-hand look at some of the medium-scale geology that is difficult to understand looking down from a satellite. In particular, some of the material deposits look like the black glass the astronauts discovered on the moon. Dr. Dunning has identified a few items in those archives that could be great deposits of a catastrophe. Also, some of the geology closely matches features produced by Yelverton in the lab. Of course, the single most compelling evidence is the enormous Valles Marineris feature near Mars' equator. If a cosmic thunderbolt is big enough, it could transform the landscape, as Yelverton has shown, and as magnetar theory implies. 67.5. 6.2 Reasons a micronova brings an ice age. There are aspects of a solar micronova that cool the planet and are different from a solar flare, which definitively produces heat. There are two scenarios worth mentioning in terms of the triggering of rapid cooling: a strictly micronova-induced ice age, and one aided or initiated by the processes described by Ken and Major White, Chan Thomas, Einstein, and Hapgood, which are purely geological. I believe there is not a need to choose, and that a combination of these two are at work in the event. Earlier in the book, we discussed the dust of the nova. Dust is a major product of stellar novae, and along with gases and plasma, will pollute the inner solar system until the solar wind and photoionizing UV light blow it away. The dust will also linger in Earth's atmosphere for a long period of time. This will provide shielding from the sun for at least a few days, maybe more, like nuclear or volcanic winter, which is more than enough to drop the temperature on Earth by a considerable degree. But is it fast enough to freeze a mammoth? We remember that we need to answer all the evidence, including a nearly instant freeze. The primary means by which planets are thought to lose their atmospheres is via stellar winds, with a magnetic field being the primary protection for those planets that have atmospheres. Mars used to have a tremendous atmosphere, one that supported oceans, but when its magnetism collapsed, the atmosphere became vulnerable to the sun and has been depleted ever since. Earth is unlikely to turn into Mars, especially since it hasn't happened in any past events, and the magnetic minimum of the excursion only lasts a short time. But we could endure the miniature version of it. During the shockwave impact of the micronova, the Earth will likely be substantially further along in the ongoing magnetic excursion, possibly in the magnetic minimum, with a substantially weaker protection for the atmosphere. Vogt believes that this could allow for partial atmospheric blow-offs that temporarily depressurize regions of the atmosphere, including near the ground. This near vacuum and the introduction of super-cooled air from the upper atmosphere could provide a great rapid chill. We know from the standing position of many of the mammoths that they were inundated instantly with frozen or freezing water and mud. This 1-2 punch of nova shell depressurization and ice flood is the best explanation for a rapid freeze of the mammoths, especially if large amounts of ice water were swallowed in the process. 68. It is interesting to note that the rest of the atmosphere would quickly rush in to fill the void, along with other outgassing from the crust to equalize the pressure. Over eons, this pressure has been maintained and will rebalance if the atmosphere takes a major mass loss. The winds provide yet another explanation for the terrible phenomena we are trying to explain in the disaster cycle. Not only would the temporary depressurization cause an instant freeze in the mammoths, but the rushing air filling the void could reach 100s of mph, and the event is likely to be felt worldwide. This can not only cause some of the surge deposits of muck by wind alone, but could produce higher waves due to the wind intensity. Both the local and global freezing makes sense from a micronova, but it gets help from geology if the crust shifts. Thomas, Major White, the Rand Corporation, and the Pentagon offered an alternative explanation for the freeze, and it does not really even require a solar micronova, just the crustal shift. If you recall, in their version, the Earth's crust unlocks from the mantle and shifts 90 degrees, with considerable influence from the magnetic fields on the water, metal, and crystals of the crust. The next cycle, it flips back exactly as it was before. In this way, the evidence of magnetic pole position in the polar regions over eons of time makes sense. It just keeps coming back. It also explains why the layers alternate between polar and tropical conditions. Every other cycle it is at the equator. Their freeze event includes an inundation of ice and water and mud with the mammoths, but it also freezes the globe over weeks to months, because the new, formerly tropical, polar areas will freeze quickly without sunlight at the polar regions, and the former polar ice, now at the equator, takes a long time to melt. It cools and freshens the oceans and atmosphere, and it reflects sunlight to cause further albedo cooling. Soon. There are 4 polar ice, 2 new ones at the new poles, and the former 2 at the equator. Numerous other researchers, like Robert Felix and Randall Carlson, come to similar conclusions linking magnetic events on Earth to rapid ice age conditions, and have determined that a solar event is likely required at some point in the catastrophe. Carlson is especially keen on a solar superflaring outburst ending the Ice Age as rapidly as it began, as is Dr. Scott and Dr. Parrott. It turns out that we may never know which is the right answer until the next one happens, at which point it is definitively less important than survival considerations. What is important is to consider the Ice Age scenario, not just for where you are now, but for where the poles might end up. More on the potential future pole positions is coming later in the book. 69 now. It is time to understand why the Earth's magnetic field is changing already, if the crescendo from the sun is still yet to come. 75. 7 galactic current sheet, triggering solar system shifts. We mentioned catastrophism theories about crossing the galactic plane, and how Chan Thomas had the same basic idea. It is a slightly misguided version based on crossing the galactic equator, rather than the true rippling wave of the galactic current sheet and fields. In laboratory settings in the solar system, and scaled up mathematically, a spinning magnetic S.